The phone buzzed 3 times before Ray Harmon heard it. He was standing in Marcus Webb's driveway, 70 miles outside of Terre Haute, rolling the kinks out of his shoulders after 10 days on the road. His boots were caked in Indiana clay. His leather vest was stiff with dried sweat and highway dust. The kind of tired that doesn't live in your muscles. The kind that gets down into your bones and stays there. He'd spent 10 days helping a brother. That's what you did. You showed up when someone needed you. You stayed until the job was done. That's the code. That's the only thing Ray had always been certain about, even when everything else in his life had come apart. The phone buzzed again. He looked down at the screen. One word. Mom. Not his mother. His mother-in-law. Ruth Ann. He hadn't changed the contact name in 3 years. Hadn't been able to bring himself to do it. He answered. The first sound he heard was not her voice. It was the sound of someone trying very hard not to cry and failing completely. Ray, she finally said. It's Lily. He didn't remember walking away from Marcus's driveway. He didn't remember the moment his hand found the fence post and held on. He would only remember the way the world tilted sideways slowly, like a ship taking on water. She collapsed at school. They took her to Memorial. The doctors are saying her appendix. It burst, Ray. They need to operate right now. He asked how long ago. She said 40 minutes. She said Lily had been asking for him. She said the words that no father ever wants to hear across 200 miles of open highway. She keeps saying, Daddy. She won't stop saying it. Ray stood in the dark and let those words hit him the way they needed to hit him. He didn't push them away. He didn't tell himself to stay calm. He just stood there in Marcus Webb's driveway under a sky full of cold October stars and felt the full weight of what was happening. Then he started moving. He told Ruth Ann he was coming. He told her to stay with Lily. He told her to tell Lily that Daddy was on his way and he wasn't stopping for anything. He hung up before his voice could break. Marcus came out of the house. He read Ray's face the way old friends learn to read each other, without words, without explanation. He gripped Ray's shoulder hard and said, just ride safe. Ray was already on the bike. The engine turned over and roared to life, and for the first time in 10 days, the sound of it didn't comfort him. It just meant motion. It just meant the gap between him and his daughter was finally starting to close. He twisted the throttle and tore out onto the highway. 200 miles. 4 hours minimum. That's what the math said. But Ray Harmon had stopped thinking in terms of what the math said the moment he heard Ruth Ann's voice crack on the other end of that line. He thought instead about the last time something like this had happened, about another highway, another night, another phone call he'd answered too late. He thought about Claire. 3 years ago, Ray had been on a club run out of Louisville. It was supposed to be a long weekend, nothing serious, just brothers on the road the way brothers sometimes needed to be. Claire had packed his bag for him. She'd stood in the doorway of their house and watched him load the bike, and she'd smiled that specific smile of hers, the one that said she understood the part of him she could never fully reach. He'd kissed her. He'd told her he'd be back Sunday. He didn't make it back Sunday. He made it back Monday morning, and by then Claire was gone. She'd been driving back from her sister's house on Highway 9 when a man 3 times the legal limit crossed the center line and took everything from Ray Harmon in the space of one heartbeat. Lily had been home with a babysitter that night. She was 4 years old. She was asleep in her bed when the world changed. Ray had stood in the hospital hallway and looked at the chaplain's face and known before a single word was spoken. He'd stood there in his road clothes, still smelling like 2 days of highway and exhaust, and he had understood with perfect and terrible clarity that he had been 200 miles away when the only person who had ever really known him needed him to be standing right beside her. He hadn't been there. That was the thing about grief that nobody warned you about. It wasn't just the loss. It was the specific shape of your failure, the precise angle at which you had let someone down. Ray had carried that angle inside him for 3 years like a piece of broken glass that never stopped cutting. And now, on a dark Indiana highway with the speedometer climbing past 90, he felt that glass shift in his chest all over again. Because here he was, on a road, 200 miles from his daughter. Again. He pushed the bike harder. The highway stretched out ahead of him, flat and dark and indifferent. Small towns came and went like brief interruptions in the blackness. Gas stations, grain elevators, church steeples, catching the moonlight and letting it go. Ray didn't see any of it. He saw only the white line unspooling beneath his front tire and the distance that still remained between him and Lily. He had a photograph taped to his speedometer. He'd been carrying it for years. It was a picture of Lily at age 5, gap-toothed and wild-haired, holding up a drawing she'd made of Ray on his motorcycle. Crayon, blue and black, and a sunset behind him that she'd colored in orange because orange was his favorite. She'd written along the bottom in shaky 5-year-old letters, "My daddy is the best rider in the world." He glanced at it every time he looked down at his speed. "Hang on, baby girl. Daddy's coming." The miles ticked away. 70, 65, 60. His phone, mounted on the handlebars, lit up twice with messages he couldn't read at this speed. He pressed the voice button and heard his mother-in-law's voice. "She's still in surgery. The doctors haven't come out yet. Please hurry, Ray." He leaned forward over the tank and gave the engine everything it had. He had been riding for just over an hour when his body sent him the first serious warning. His hands had been shaking on the handlebars for the last 20 miles, not from cold, not from nerves alone, but from hunger. He'd eaten a gas station sandwich at noon and nothing since. The kind of emptiness that starts as discomfort and becomes dangerous. His vision was beginning to blur at the edges just slightly, just enough to notice. He could not afford to pass out 90 miles from the hospital. The sign for Crowfield appeared in his headlight. Population 3,200. Exit in 1 mile. He took the exit. Crowfield, Indiana looked the way most small Indiana towns look at that hour. Quiet in a way that wasn't peaceful, just empty. The main street had 3 stoplights and a hardware store and a barber shop with a hand-painted sign in the window. A bank. A pharmacy. A Baptist church with a reader board out front that said, "Prayer changes things." Ray didn't know if that was true. He'd prayed every night for 3 years, and Claire was still gone. He found the diner 2 blocks off the main drag. Mama's Table. The neon sign in the window flickered orange and white. Through the glass, he could see maybe 15 people inside families, mostly a couple of older men at the counter, a table of teenagers in the back corner. Normal people doing normal things on a Thursday night. He cut the engine. He sat on the bike for a moment and looked at himself in the small mirror mounted to the handlebars. 3 days of stubble. Eyes that had too much highway in them. The Hells Angels patch on his vest front and center the way it always was. The way it had been for 20 years. He had never once been ashamed of that patch. He pushed through the door. The bell above it chimed, and the room stopped, not all at once. It happened the way a ripple moves across water. First, the nearest tables went quiet, then the ones behind them. Then the teenagers in the back corner put their phones down for the first time, in probably hours. The older men at the counter turned on their stools. A woman near the window pulled her daughter closer, without appearing to realize she was doing it. Ray stood in the doorway and met the silence head on. He had done this 1,000 times. Walked into a room and felt the temperature drop because of what he was wearing. You got used to it the way you got used to a lot of things. You learned how to stand in the middle of it and not flinch. He was looking for a booth in the corner when she came out of the kitchen. She was maybe 30 years old, with her hair pulled back tight, and an apron that had seen a long shift. Her name tag said, Darlene. She came out of the kitchen wiping her hands on a dish towel, and she looked at Ray the way very few people in that room were looking at him. Not with fear, not with the particular kind of hostility that people wrap around themselves when they want to feel righteous about their prejudice. She looked at him like he was a man who had come through her door and needed something. Welcome to Mama's table, she said. Her voice carried across the room like it owned the room because it did. This was her place. You could feel that in the way she stood. Take any seat. What can I get you? Someone coughed at a nearby table. A pointed sound. The kind of sound that's meant to be heard. Ray chose the booth in the corner, the one with his back to the wall, and a clear line to the door. Old habit. He sat down, and the vinyl creaked under him. The woman in the floral dress 3 tables over raised her voice. Darlene, she said. Her name was Mrs. Hartwell. Ray would learn that later. At the moment, she was just a woman in a floral dress whose voice had the particular quality of someone who was used to people listening to her. I need you to come here a moment. I'll be with you shortly, Mrs. Hartwell. Darlene didn't stop walking toward Ray's booth. That is not a customer. That is a Darlene set a menu down in front of Ray. She met his eyes. Her expression hadn't changed. You look like you've been on the road a while. What do you need? Something fast, Ray said. Anything. I have to keep moving. My daughter's in surgery. He hadn't meant to say that last part. It came out before he could stop it. Maybe because he hadn't said it out loud to anyone yet. And some part of him needed to hear it in his own voice to make it real. Something shifted in Darlene's face, not pity. Something closer to recognition. Like she understood what it meant to be in motion towards someone you loved and have the world keep slowing you down. Meatloaf special, she said quietly. Fastest thing in the kitchen tonight. I'll have Miguel rush it. Coffee while you wait. Please. She wrote it down and started back toward the kitchen. She didn't make it 3 steps. Darlene. Mrs. Hartwell's voice had hardened. I am speaking to you. I will not sit in the same establishment as a man like that." "Then you're welcome to leave," Darlene said without turning around. "Your money will be refunded at the register." The table of teenagers laughed, not kindly. One of the men at the counter stood up, tucked his jacket under his arm, and headed for the door without looking at anyone. A family in the middle of the room gathered their children and followed. The bell above the door chimed, and chimed again. Ray watched his hands on the table. He kept them flat, kept them still. He thought about Lily. He thought about the photograph on his speedometer. He thought about the fact that whatever happened in this diner in the next 20 minutes, there was a little girl in an ICU 90 miles away who needed him to get there in one piece. Darlene came back with coffee. She poured it without her hand shaking. "Don't mind them," she said. "I'm sorry for the trouble. You're not the trouble." She went back to the kitchen. Mrs. Hartwell made one more attempt loudly to make her displeasure known to anyone who would listen. The old man at the counter banged his cane against the floor once hard and said something about standards. 2 more families left. The bell chimed. Ray drank his coffee and thought about Claire, and thought about Lily, and thought about how strange it was that the world could be so busy deciding what kind of man you were, when all you were trying to do was get to your daughter. Darlene came back with his plate. The steam rising off the meatloaf was the best thing Ray had seen in hours. "My mama used to say something," Darlene told him, setting the plate down. "She said every person who comes through that door has a story, has a life, has people they love. Don't you ever forget that." Ray looked up at her. "She sounds like she was a wise woman." She was. Darlene's voice softened just slightly at the edges. "I lost her 2 years ago. This place is all I have left of her." Ray looked around the half-empty diner, the flickering neon sign in the window, the photographs on the walls, decades of them, the same building in different eras, different faces, the same warmth underneath. "She'd be proud of you," he said. He meant it. Darlene looked at him for a moment longer than was necessary for a transaction between strangers. Then she nodded once and went to check on the remaining tables. Ray ate. He ate fast and with purpose, the way a man eats when food is fuel and nothing more. He was halfway through the plate when he heard footsteps behind him, fast and deliberate, and looked up to see Mrs. Hartwell coming back through the door. Her purse clutched to her chest. Her face flushed red above the collar of her floral dress. "My wallet," she said. Her voice was shaking. "I got to my car and realized my wallet is missing. It was in my purse when I sat down. And now, it isn't there. And you," she pointed at Ray, "you're the only one who could have taken it." Ray set down his fork. He kept his voice level. He kept his hands visible on the table. "I haven't moved from this booth since I sat down." "Liar." She was nearly shouting now. "Tom, call the police. Someone call the police right now. He is a Hell's Angel." Her husband, a small, miserable-looking man, already had his phone out. Darlene came from the kitchen fast. She positioned herself between Mrs. Hartwell and Ray's booth. "He has been sitting in plain sight since the moment he walked in. I have been watching him. He did not take your wallet." "Of course you'd say that." Mrs. Hartwell's voice pitched higher. "You let him in here. You served him. Whatever happens in this place is on you." The door opened 4 minutes later. Not a regular deputy. The man who walked in was wearing the full uniform of the Crowfield County Sheriff's Department, complete with the silver star on his chest and the careful blankness of a man who had decided something before he'd even stepped through the door. Sheriff Walt Pruitt. He was in his mid-50s, broad. The kind of broad that used to be muscle and had been slowly converting to something else for the last decade. He had pale eyes that moved across the room and found Ray immediately. And when they did something behind them, sharpened. Ray had seen that look before. It wasn't law enforcement. It was recognition of a different kind. "Someone called about a theft," Pruitt said. His voice was unhurried. He had all the time in the world. "Yes." Mrs. Hartwell stepped forward and told her story. She told it loudly and with many gestures in Ray's direction. Pruitt listened with the patience of a man who had already made up his mind. Then he walked to Ray's booth. "Sir, I'm going to need you to stand up and place your hands where I can see them." Ray stood slowly. He kept his movements deliberate and visible. He had done nothing wrong, and he knew it. And it didn't matter at all because in this room with this man wearing that star, the facts were secondary to the story people had already decided to tell about him. Pruitt patted him down, thoroughly. Pockets emptied onto the table. Wallet, keys, phone change, the small roll of electrical tape. He always carried a crumpled receipt from a gas station in Louisville. $23 in cash. No wallet belonging to Mrs. Hartwell. "Check his jacket," she insisted. Pruitt checked the jacket. Every pocket. Nothing. His motorcycle. "He's probably all ready," Ma'am Pruitt said. "We can't search a man's vehicle without probable cause or consent. He's a Hell's Angel." "Isn't that sufficient?" "It is not," Pruitt said. But his eyes stayed on Ray's for a moment too long. There was something communicating itself in that look. Something that wasn't about the law at all. Mrs. Hartwell huffed and dug through her purse one more time. Her hand went under the front flap. Stopped. When she straightened up, she was holding a brown leather wallet. The room went silent. Darlene leaned against the counter with her arms folded. Mrs. Hartwell stared at the wallet in her hand. "It was in a different compartment. I didn't realize." Pruitt turned to Ray. He took his time doing it. "You're free to go," he said finally. "Sorry for the inconvenience." The words came out perfectly flat. No embarrassment. No acknowledgement of what had just been put Ray through in front of a room full of people. Just the procedural language of a man who had performed a function and was moving on. Ray gathered his things from the table. His hands were steady. His jaw was set. He thought about Lily. He paid Darlene at the counter more than the meal cost, and she pushed half of it back across the counter without making a production of it. "Your daughter's gonna be fine," she said quietly. "I can feel it. Now go." Ray went. He pushed out through the door and walked across the gravel parking lot toward his bike, in the far corner where he left it under the edge of the light. The October air was cold against his face. Above the town, the sky was enormous and completely indifferent to the specifics of one man's night. He saw the bike. He stopped. For a moment, he just stood there in the dark and looked at what had been done. The rear tire was flat. Not a slow leak. Flat, completely flat, the rim sitting nearly on the gravel. He crouched down and found the valve stem. It had been deliberately loosened. He moved to the engine compartment. Spark plug wires pulled loose and neatly coiled to one side, as if someone wanted him to find them and understand that this was intentional. He checked the oil reservoir. Fine sand or maybe dirt poured in through the cap, which had been left slightly ajar. This was not vandalism. This was precise. This was someone who knew what they were doing. Someone who had looked at this motorcycle and understood exactly which three things to damage to ensure it would not start, and had done it quickly and quietly while Ray was occupied inside. While Sheriff Pruitt was taking his time, Ray stood up slowly in the dark parking lot. The rage moved through him like heat starting in his chest and working outward to his hands. And he stood still inside it and let it pass. The way you let a wave pass, when you know the ocean has 10,000 more behind it, and there's no point in fighting the first one. Then he heard footsteps on the gravel behind him. He turned. Coming across the parking lot from the direction of the side street, moving casually, was a young man, maybe 17, wearing jeans and a gray jacket. His right hand swung loosely at his side, and in the yellow sodium light from the street lamp, Ray could see a dark smear across the back of his knuckles. Engine oil. The young man saw Ray looking at him. He didn't stop walking. He didn't speed up. He just held Ray's gaze for exactly 2 seconds with an expression of complete absence, the careful non-expression of someone who had rehearsed this moment. And then he looked away and walked on. Ray watched him go. He recognized the shape of that face, the jaw, the set of the shoulders. He'd seen it earlier tonight at the gas station 2 blocks away, standing next to a man in his 50s who had been talking to Sheriff Walt Pruitt in a voice low enough to be private. He didn't know the name yet. He would learn it soon enough. But he understood now, completely and precisely. He had been set up from the moment he pulled into Crowfield. The accusation inside the diner, the extended search, the time it had taken for the sheriff to finish his business and allow Ray to leave. All of it was a clock. Someone had been buying minutes, and they had used those minutes to make sure Ray Harmon wasn't going anywhere tonight. He stood in the parking lot with a dead motorcycle and 90 miles still between him and Lily. And he did the only thing available to him. He started pushing. 700 pounds of machine doesn't want to move. You have to convince it. You have to put your shoulder into it and find a rhythm and stay in that rhythm, no matter what your back is telling you. About the last 10 days, Ray pushed the bike out of the parking lot and onto the sidewalk and started moving down Main Street in the direction his phone's GPS told him to go. He found the first repair shop 4 blocks down, Greer's Auto and Cycle. The lights were still on in the garage bay. He pushed the bike up the driveway and a man in coveralls looked up from under a pickup truck's hood. He was in his 50s, thick forearms, gray at the temples. He took one look at Ray, one look at the Hells Angels patch and stood up straight. "We're closed. Your lights are on for paying customers." The man wiped his hands on a rag he didn't need to wipe. "Not for your kind. I'll pay double. Triple. Name the price. It's not about the price." The man walked to his workbench and put it between them. "I know who you people are. I know what you do. I don't do business with criminals. I'm not a criminal. I'm a father trying to get to his daughter. She's in surgery right now." The man said nothing. His face said everything. It said he'd already decided and facts were not relevant to decisions already made. Ray pushed the bike back out to the sidewalk. The second shop was 6 blocks further. Jackson's Garage. Single-bay older building, the kind of place that had been operating since before the interstate bypassed it and left it behind. An older man was pulling down the garage door when Ray arrived. "Please," Ray called out. "My daughter's in surgery. My bike's been sabotaged. I just need 30 minutes. The man turned. He was in his 60s, thin with the weathered quality of someone who had been dealing with heavy things for a long time. His eyes found the patch the way everyone's eyes did, and he took a step back. "We don't serve bikers here. Please just listen to me for a... My boy got mixed up with a motorcycle club 12 years ago." The man's voice cracked on the last syllable just slightly, the way old grief will crack through even the thickest scar tissue when you press directly on it. "He ended up dead in a ditch outside of Evansville. So no, I won't help you. I won't help any of you. Get away from my property." He yanked the garage door down with a sound like a gunshot. The lights went out. Ray stood in the sudden dark. He wanted to say something. He understood the man's loss. He understood it in a way that went straight through his chest, to somewhere permanent. But there was nothing to say. There was only the push bar of the motorcycle in his hands, and the road ahead, and the distance still to cover. The third shop was Morgan's Repair, 4 blocks further at the edge of town. The chain-link gate was padlocked. A sign zip-tied to the fence read, "Hours Monday to Friday, 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. Ray rattled the gate. He called out. He stood in the silence that answered him and breathed. His phone lit up. A message from Ruth Ann. "She's still in surgery. The doctors haven't said anything yet." "Where are you?" He typed back with shaking thumbs. "Bike trouble. Coming as fast as I can." He sat down with his back against the chain-link fence. The dead motorcycle leaning beside him. And for a moment, just a moment, he let himself understand the full weight of what was happening. Not the rage, not the logistics, just the weight. He was 90 miles from Lily. His bike was dead. 3 mechanics had refused him. And whatever was happening in that operating room was happening without him. Just like Claire's last moments had happened without him. He had been on the road then too. He had been somewhere else then too. He sat in the dark and felt that broken glass feeling move through him again, slower this time, more thorough. He thought about what it meant to keep failing the people you loved in the same specific way. He thought about the pattern of it. The road always between him and the people who needed him most. He was still sitting there when he noticed the light. It was at the very end of the block at a building so small it barely qualified as a commercial structure. More of a large shed, really, with a concrete apron in front and an old car up on blocks to one side. The light coming from inside was the kind of light that means someone is still working the direct, narrow beam of a work lamp aimed at whatever needs fixing. There was no Google pin for it. There was no Yelp listing. There was a hand-painted wooden sign mounted above the door on 2 eye hooks. And in the orange glow of the nearest streetlight, Ray could just make out the words, "Foster's Garage." He grabbed the handlebars and pushed. He pushed the last 100 yards through a body that had given him every warning it had, and was now simply working on something below warning, below the threshold, where protest registers. His shoulders burned. His lower back had stopped communicating entirely. His hands were so stiff from gripping that they didn't fully open when he released the bars. He pushed the bike into the pool of light coming from the open garage door. A boy looked up. He was maybe 14 years old. Small for it, or maybe just built lean the way boys sometimes are, before the years filled him out. He was wearing coveralls that were at least 2 sizes too large, rolled at the ankles, and he had a wrench in one hand and grease on both forearms to the elbow. He'd been crouched over a small engine, some kind of small equipment motor, set up on a wooden work table, and he straightened up now and looked at Ray with the particular directness of a kid who had learned not to waste time being surprised. He looked at the motorcycle. He looked at Ray's vest. He looked at Ray's face. "Hey," he said, "your bike looks rough." What happened? Ray's voice came out rougher than he intended. "Someone sabotaged it. I need to get to my daughter. She's in surgery at Memorial Hospital. 90 miles. The boy set the wrench down on the workbench. Just like that. No hesitation. "Let me take a look." Ray almost said something. He almost asked the boy his age, or whether his parents knew he was out here working this late, or how much this was going to cost, or any of a dozen practical questions that would have been the wrong questions. Instead, he watched as the boy walked directly to the motorcycle and crouched beside the rear tire and began examining the valve stem with the focused attention of someone doing work. They understood completely. "You're not scared of me," Ray said. "The patch." The boy didn't look up. "My mama says you judge people by what they do, not by what they're wearing." He ran his hand along the tire sidewall, checking. "What you've done so far is push a broken bike however far it took to get here. Doesn't sound scary to me." Ray leaned against the door frame and watched this child work. "What's your name, Dex?" The boy moved to the engine. "Dex Foster." He checked the spark plug wires, found where they'd been disconnected, began carefully tracing each one back to its terminal. His hands were quick and precise. "Ray Harmon." "I know," Dex said. "Your name's on your wallet. I can see it sticking out of your pocket." Despite everything, Ray almost smiled. "How old are you?" Dex, 14. 15 in March. "And you run this place?" "After school and weekends." Dex didn't say it with any particular pride or complaint, just stated it the way you state a fact that has been true long enough to stop feeling unusual. "My dad taught me the basics. He passed when I was 8. Mom works 2 jobs. This helps." Ray looked around the garage, the tools arranged on pegboard, with careful outlines drawn around each one. "So you always knew where it belonged." The small notebook open on the workbench with entries in neat handwriting. The old car on blocks in the corner partially disassembled someone's project that was being worked through methodically, piece by piece. "What was your dad's name?" Ray asked. "James," Dex said. "James Foster." Ray was quiet for a moment. He looked at the back of the boy's neck, bent over the engine in concentration. Something had shifted in his chest. Something he couldn't quite name, a recognition that operated below the level of words. "He was a good man," Ray said carefully. "James Foster." Dex looked up from the engine. His face was still. You knew him, I knew of him. He had a reputation in certain circles. He was the best person I ever knew. Dex held Ray's gaze for a moment, then went back to the engine. He said something once. He said the patch doesn't make the man makes the patch. He said that to me when I was 6, and I didn't understand it yet. I think I understand it now. Ray said nothing. He stayed in the doorway and let this 14-year-old kid, who had his father's face, and apparently his father's code work on his motorcycle in the middle of a Thursday night, and he felt the glass in his chest rearrange itself into something that cut differently than it had before. His phone lit up again. Still in surgery. She's stable right now. Doctor says it's serious, but she's fighting. Please hurry. Ray looked at the message for a long time. She fighting, he said almost to himself. Dex didn't look up. Then she'll make it. Fighters make it. He said it with a certainty that had nothing to do with naivety. It was the certainty of a kid who had watched his mother work 2 jobs for 6 years and had set up a garage operation at age 8 with a set of tools his father left him, and had decided somewhere along the way that the facts of a situation were less relevant than what you did inside them. I can fix this, Dex said. 30-40 minutes. The tire I can patch. The oil reservoir I'll flush and replace what I can from my own stock. The plug wires are just a reconnection. Whoever did this knew what they were doing, but they also knew they didn't have a lot of time. They went for speed over permanence. Ray watched him work. He thought about Lily lying in a hospital bed, 90 miles away with Ruth Ann holding her hand, and a surgical team doing something Ray couldn't help with, no matter how fast he rode. He thought about Claire. He thought about all the miles he'd put between himself and the people who needed him. He thought about this boy, 14 years old, crouched over a stranger's motorcycle at midnight, because his mother had taught him that you judge a person by what they do. I had a daughter once, Ray said. The words came out before he decided to say them. Not Lily. Before Lily. She was pregnant when we first got together. We lost the baby, a boy. We would have named him Daniel. He didn't know why he said it. He hadn't said it to anyone in years. Maybe because the night had already taken everything else from him, and there was a strange kind of freedom in that. Maybe because this boy with his father's face and his father's code was the only person who had looked at Ray Harmon tonight and seen a man instead of a threat. I'm sorry, Dex said simply. Ray nodded. Lily is everything he said. She's all I've got left. Her mother's gone. It's just us. Dex looked up from the engine. He looked at Ray for a long moment. Then I better get you there, he said, and went back to work. It took 38 minutes. Ray stood in the doorway of that small garage and watched this boy work with the unhurried efficiency of someone twice his age, and outside the October sky moved slowly toward midnight. And somewhere 90 miles away, his daughter was fighting. Dex patched the tire. He flushed the oil reservoir with the practiced speed of a kid who had done this operation more times than he could count using the motor oil he kept stocked in neat quart containers along the back wall. He reconnected the spark plug wires one by one, checking each connection twice. When he was done, he stood up, wiped his hands on a rag, and said, "Let's see if she starts." Ray got on the bike. His hands found the grips. His right foot found the kick. He turned the key. The engine coughed once, twice, and on the third attempt it caught, and the sound of it in that small garage was like something returning from a long distance. Dex grinned. It was the first time he'd grinned the entire time, and it transformed his face, completely lit it up from somewhere behind his eyes. "She sounds good," he said. "She'll get you 90 miles. How much do I owe you?" Dex shook his head. Ray pulled out his wallet, everything he had. $23. He held it out. Dex pushed his hand back gently. "Buy your daughter something when she gets out. Some flowers. Something she'd like." Ray looked at this boy. At the coveralls too big for him. At the grease on his forearms. At the garage his dead father had built around him like a gift from across 6 years of silence. "Your dad would be proud," Ray said. Dex looked at the floor for a moment, then back up. "I hope so." He paused. "He wants to see your little girl grow up. So go." Ray kicked the bike into gear. He pulled out of the small garage and onto the dark street. He looked back once. Dex was standing in the doorway in his 2 big coveralls, one hand raised. Ray raised his hand back. Then he twisted the throttle and the engine roared and Crowfield, Indiana began to fall away behind him. The speedometer climbed. 70, 80, 90. The photograph of Lily was still taped to the dash, slightly wind-curled at one corner, but still there, still holding. Her gap-toothed smile in crayon blue and orange. "My daddy is the best rider in the world. Daddy's coming, baby girl." Ray leaned over the tank and gave the engine everything it had left. 90 miles. The white line pulled him forward. The cold October air hit his face like a hand pressing him back, and he leaned into it. He thought about Frank Greer's son and his oil-stained hands. He thought about Sheriff Pruitt's careful, unhurried eyes. He thought about Darlene Webb standing her ground in that diner while the room emptied around her. He thought about Dex Foster, 14 years old, and James Foster's son fixing a stranger's motorcycle at midnight for nothing but the principle of the thing. He thought about all of it, and he rode. 90 miles. The clock on his phone said 11:47 p.m. He had people to get back to. Memorial Hospital appeared on the horizon the way salvation sometimes does. Not all at once. First, just a glow against the black sky, the particular kind of light that never fully turns off, because the work inside it never fully stops. Then the blue H signs appearing at intervals along the off-ramp, each one a little larger than the last, pulling him forward like a current. Ray took the exit at 1:14 in the morning. He had pushed the bike past 100 for most of the last 40 miles. His eyes were raw from the wind. His hands had gone partially numb around the grips somewhere around the 60-mile mark and hadn't fully come back. He didn't notice any of it. He was operating on something below the level of physical sensation. Now some older and more fundamental system that had taken over when everything else had been spent. He pulled into the hospital parking lot and cut the engine. The silence hit him like a wall. He sat on the bike for 3 seconds, maybe 4. Then he swung off and ran. Through the automatic doors, past the reception desk where a woman in scrubs called something after him, into the elevator, jabbing the button for the 4th floor, with his thumb standing in the mirrored box, while it rose with agonizing patience, watching his own face in the polished metal. the road-wrecked face of a man who had been several versions of himself tonight and wasn't entirely sure which one was gonna walk through that ICU door. 4th floor. The doors opened. A nurse's station directly ahead. A long corridor lined with closed doors, each one holding something critical. The smell of antiseptic and recycled air, and the particular hush of a place where noise feels like a violation. A nurse at the station looked up. Before she could speak, Ray said the name. Lily Harmon. My daughter. She just came out of surgery. The nurse's face shifted. Something in it released. She stood up. Follow me, she said. She walked him down the corridor and stopped outside room 412. She turned to face him before she opened the door. She told him what the doctor had told Ruth Ann, that the surgery had gone longer than expected, that the infection had spread further than the initial imaging suggested, that they had removed the appendix and a portion of compromised intestine, that Lily was stable, now sedated on IV antibiotics, and that the next 24 hours would tell them most of what they needed to know. But she's alive, Ray said. She's alive, the nurse confirmed. She's a fighter, Mr. Harmon. And she kept asking for you even under sedation. Ray put his hand flat against the door. He pushed it open. The room was small and very quiet. The machines around the bed registered Lily's presence in green and amber numbers, her heart rate and oxygen and blood pressure, all being translated into data by devices that didn't know what they were measuring. Didn't know that what they were measuring was everything. The IV stand held 3 bags. There were tubes. There were wires. And in the center of all of it, in a hospital bed that was too large for her by a factor that made his chest seize, was Lily. She looked so small. Ray had known she was small. He knew her exact height and weight the way fathers know these things from doctors' visits and doorframe measurements and the specific way she fit against his shoulder when he carried her. But knowing a thing and seeing it are different operations. Seeing her in that bed with all of that equipment arranged around her to keep her in the world. He understood small in a new and permanent way. Ruth Ann was in the chair beside the bed holding Lily's hand. She looked up when Ray came in and her face did something complicated. Relief and exhaustion, and 3 years of accumulated grief all moving across it at once. She stood up slowly, and Ray crossed the room in 3 steps, and they stood together beside the bed, without saying anything for a long moment. Then Ruth Ann put her arms around him and held on. He let her. He stood in the middle of that small room with his road-filthy jacket and his highway-worn hands, and let his mother-in-law hold him, the way she used to hold Claire. And he felt something in him that had been rigid for a very long time begin to give slightly at the edges. "I'm sorry," he said into her shoulder. "I'm sorry I wasn't here sooner. You're here now. That's what matters." He pulled back and looked at Lily's face. Even sedated, even pale, even with the tube taped at the corner of her mouth, she looked like herself in all the ways that counted. The slight upturn at the end of her nose, the way her dark hair fell across the pillow, the same way Claire's used to. The small hands, both of them, one held by Ruth Ann and one lying open at her side, like an invitation. Ray sat down on the edge of the chair. He took her open hand in both of his. It was warm, small and warm, and real. "I'm here, baby girl," he said quietly. "Daddy's right here. You don't have to keep asking for me anymore." He sat there for a long time. The machines beeped their steady reassurance. Ruth Ann settled into the second chair they'd brought in and dozed with her chin on her chest. Ray held Lily's hand and watched her breathe and let the night settle around him. The doctor came at 2:30. Dr. Alvarez, a man in his 40s with the measured calm of someone who delivered hard news often enough to have developed a specific language for it. He went through the details again more thoroughly this time with Ray. The extent of the infection, the tissue they'd had to remove, the recovery timeline, which he described as weeks, not days, and the need for careful monitoring over the next 24 hours. Ray asked the question he'd been carrying since Louisville. If I'd gotten here 2 hours later. Dr. Alvarez held his gaze. He didn't soften it. Another 2 hours and we would have been having a very different conversation. Ray nodded. He'd known. He'd felt the shape of it in the way Ruth Ann's voice had sounded on the phone. But knowing and hearing it confirmed were different things, and he sat with the confirmed version of it while the doctor finished his notes and told him to get some rest if he could. Ray did not get some rest. He sat beside his daughter and watched her breathe until the sky outside the window began to shift from black to the deep gray that comes before dawn. He watched it move through gray to pale blue, to the tentative orange of an early October morning in Indiana. He watched his daughter's chest rise and fall, with the patient rhythm of a body doing the serious work of healing itself. Around 6 in the morning, Lily's eyes opened. Not all the way, just a sliver. The particular partial consciousness of someone surfacing through heavy sedation, finding the world unfamiliar and retreating slightly, then finding something familiar enough to surface further. She found his face. Daddy. Her voice was barely there. A whisper scraped rough by the breathing tube they'd removed the previous evening. But it was her voice, completely and unmistakably her voice. And Ray felt the word go through him like something physical. "I'm here, sweetheart. Right here. You came." "Of course I came. I knew you would." She almost smiled. Her eyes were still only half open. "I told Grandma Ruth you'd come. I told you I would. Nothing was gonna stop me." She drifted back under. Her hand tightened slightly around his and then relaxed, the grip loosening as sleep pulled her back down. But she was smiling when she went. Just barely. Just enough. Ray sat in the chair and pressed her hand against his forehead and closed his eyes. He gave himself 5 minutes. 5 minutes of sitting in the knowledge that she was alive and she had smiled, and she was gonna be all right. 5 minutes of letting that be enough just for a moment before the rest of the night's events came back to collect what they were owed. He thought about Darlene Webb, who had sent half of his money back across the counter and told him to go be with his daughter. He thought about Dex Foster, 14 years old with grease on his forearms, who had fixed his motorcycle at midnight and refused to take a single dollar for it. He thought about Frank Greer's son, crossing that parking lot with oil on his hands and nothing on his face. He thought about Sheriff Walt Pruitt and his careful, unhurried eyes. He pulled out his phone. He found Darlene's number. She'd written it on the back of the receipt she'd tucked into the bag with the 2 slices of pecan pie she'd sent along for the road. He hadn't been able to eat them. They were still in his saddlebag. He dialed. She answered on the second ring. The sound of the kitchen behind her pots and early morning prep. Mama's table. Darlene. It's Ray Harmon. From last night. A pause. Then her voice shifted. How's your daughter? She made it through surgery. She woke up a little while ago. She's gonna be okay. He heard Darlene exhale. A long and genuine exhale. Thank God. She was quiet for a moment. I'm glad you made it. I wanted to call and thank you. What you did last night, standing your ground like that when everyone else was walking out. It meant something. It meant more than I could say in that diner. I just did what was right. I know. That's why it meant something. There was a silence on the line that felt heavier than the words around it. Ray noticed it the way you notice a change in weather before you can identify specifically what has changed. Darlene, he said. What happened? Another silence. Longer. It's not your problem, she said finally. Tell me anyway. She told him. The supply company that had been providing Mama's table with dry goods and produce for 11 years had called that morning at 7:30 and canceled the contract. No warning, no prior indication of any problem. The representative on the phone had been brief and impersonal, and had cited when pressed a vague reference to a review of their client accounts. Darlene had called the account manager she'd worked with directly for 4 years. He hadn't answered. That was the first thing. The second was the bank. She'd gotten an automated notice at 6 in the morning before she'd even opened that her business line of credit was being reviewed and temporarily suspended, pending resolution of a complaint that had been filed against the account. She didn't know who had filed it. The automated system couldn't tell her that. She was supposed to call a number between 9 and 5 on business days to speak with a representative, and the third thing was a man in a suit who had knocked on the front door of Mama's table at 8:15 in the morning, 45 minutes before opening, and handed her a business card. He represented a development company. The company was interested in acquiring the property. The offer was below market value significantly, and the card had Frank Greer's name on it as a referring party. Ray was quiet for a moment. How long has Greer been after your building? He asked. Darlene's voice went tight. My mama turned him down 3 times in the last 8 years. He wanted to put a tire shop on the lot. She wouldn't sell. She left the building to me when she passed. I've turned him down twice since then, and now he's using last night as leverage. I lost half my customers before closing. I don't know how many will come back. If the supply contract is gone and the credit line is suspended, I can't operate through the month. Ray was standing now, though he didn't remember getting up. He was at the window looking out at the parking lot below at his motorcycle in the handicapped adjacent space where he'd left it in his sprint for the door. Darlene, he said, I'm gonna handle this. Ray. Her voice had a specific quality now, the quality of someone who has dealt with certain kinds of situations for long enough to know how they tend to go. You have a daughter in the hospital. You go home to her when she's released, and you don't look back. This isn't your fight. You made it my fight when you stood up for me last night. I didn't stand up for you because I wanted something in return. I know that. That's exactly why I'm going to handle it. He could hear her thinking on the other end of the line. He could hear the kitchen sounds behind her. The particular busy hum of a woman who had opened her mother's diner at 6 in the morning despite everything, because that was what you did with the thing that had been left to you. "Be careful," she said finally. He told Ruth Ann he'd be back by evening. Ruth Ann had been awake for 2 hours by then, sitting with her coffee and watching Lily sleep. And she looked at Ray with an expression that said she understood more than he'd told her. She was that kind of woman. Had always been that kind of woman, which was presumably where Claire had learned it. She told him to go do what he needed to do, and that Lily wasn't going anywhere, and she'd call him the moment anything changed. He kissed Lily's forehead and left. The drive back to Crowfield took an hour and 40 minutes. The morning had turned cold and sharp, the particular October cold that carries the first real suggestion of the winter behind it. Ray rode it with his face set and his hands steady on the bars, and he thought about what he was going to do when he got there. He saw the diner first. He'd already known from what Darlene had described, but knowing and seeing were different. The front wall of Mama's table had been hit sometime in the night, black spray paint wide and careless covering the lower half of the warm yellow brick. Words Ray would not repeat to anyone. The word traitor in letters 2 feet high. An arrow pointing at the front door. He sat on his bike and looked at it for a moment. Then he drove to the other end of the town. Foster's garage looked worse in daylight than anything he'd imagined. The front window had been punched in completely safety glass, scattered across the concrete apron, in a broad fan that caught the morning light. The tools that had been hanging on the exterior pegboard rack, the one Dex used for larger equipment that didn't fit inside, had been knocked to the ground, and several of them bent deliberately, the kind of bending that requires a specific intention to render something permanently useless. The oil drum in the corner had been kicked over. The dark stain of it spread across the concrete in the shape of something that looked like a bruise. The hand-painted sign that had said Foster's Garage had been spray-painted over. The same handwriting as the wall of Mama's table. Norma Foster was standing in front of the garage. She was wearing her nursing scrubs, the pale blue ones with the hospital logo on the chest pocket. And she had clearly been standing there for some time before Ray arrived, because she had the particular stillness of a woman who has gotten past the initial shock and arrived somewhere harder and quieter. She watched Ray park the bike. She watched him take in the damage. When he looked at her, her expression was controlled and exhausted. He told her who he was. She already knew. Dex had told her about the man with the motorcycle and the daughter in surgery. "I wanted to check on you both," Ray said. "And I wanted to see this for myself." Norma looked at the garage. Her hands were folded in front of her in the way of someone who is keeping them folded to prevent them from doing something else. "Dex is at school. I told him to go. I didn't want him here when I came home and saw this." "Did you call the police?" She looked at him with the flat patience of a woman who had learned exactly how certain questions land. "Sheriff Pruitt sent a deputy," she said. "He took some photographs and wrote things in a notebook and said he'd file a report, and that these situations were often difficult to resolve without witnesses or direct evidence." Then he left. Ray looked at the bent tools on the ground, at the smashed window, at a 14-year-old kid's inheritance deliberately destroyed. "How much to replace the window?" he asked. She named a figure. It wasn't a large figure in the abstract. It was a very large figure for a woman working 2 nursing shifts to keep a household operational. "I'll cover it," Ray said. She started to refuse. He raised his hand gently. "James Foster helped build what I'm part of," he said. He didn't say it for the club's sake. He said it because it's the right thing to do. His kid fixed my bike last night and wouldn't take $1. The least I can do is make sure he still has a garage to work in. Norma looked at him for a long moment. Something moved behind her eyes that she didn't let reach her face. "He talks about that man all the time," she said. "James. He's got his tools. He's got his notebooks. He watches the same videos James used to watch about engine restoration." She paused. "He's gonna be okay, isn't he?" "Dex, whoever did this, they're not gonna come back." "No," Ray said. "They're not gonna come back." He said it the way you say something when you intend to make it true. He left Norma Foster standing in front of her late husband's garage and drove 2 blocks to the commercial district. He found Greer's auto and cycle. It looked different in daylight, larger than it had seemed the previous night, with 2 full service bays and a small retail showroom visible through the plate glass. A sign in the window advertised tire installation and state inspections. Ray parked across the street. He sat on the bike and watched the shop for a few minutes. Frank Greer's truck was in the lot. A newer model, well-maintained, the kind of vehicle that announces a certain comfort with where its owner has positioned himself in life. Ray thought about going in. He thought about standing across a counter from the man who had coordinated the sabotage of his motorcycle, who had sent his own son out to do it, while Walt Pruitt ran interference inside the diner, and saying whatever needed to be said directly and without intermediary. He was still thinking about this when the door of the shop opened and Frank Greer came. He was in his mid-50s, heavy set in the way of a man who had been physically capable at some earlier point and was running on the residual confidence of that. He was wearing a collared shirt with his shop logo on the breast pocket. He walked to his truck, opened the door, and then noticed Ray across the street. They looked at each other. Greer's face went through a fast sequence of expressions. Surprise was first, then a carefully constructed blankness, then, very briefly, something that might have been calculation. Ray got off the bike. He crossed the street at a normal pace. He put his hands in his jacket pockets, not because he was cold, but because he wanted them somewhere visible and unthreatening. He stopped about 10 feet from Greer and looked at him. "My bike got fixed," he said. "Made it to the hospital in time. My daughter's going to be okay." Greer said nothing. "I wanted you to know that," Ray said. "Whoever thought they were going to slow me down last night didn't manage it. I wanted to make sure that was clear." I don't know what you're talking about," Greer said. His voice was steady, practiced. "Your boy needs to wash his hands better," Ray said. "Engine oil has a way of staying in the knuckle creases." Something moved behind Greer's eyes. A brief reassessment. "I think you should leave Crowfield," he said, "before something else goes wrong." Ray looked at him for a long moment. He cataloged the man. The way he was standing, slightly turned toward the open truck door, not quite blocking, but positioned for quick access to the cab. The way his chin was slightly elevated. The way his voice had settled into a cadence that was meant to sound like a warning, but was actually structured more like fear hiding behind aggression. "I'll be leaving soon enough," Ray said, "but not before some things get addressed." He turned and walked back across the street. He had what he needed. Not evidence, not yet. But he understood the shape of it now completely. He understood it the way you understand a machine once you've seen enough of its moving parts. He was unlocking his saddlebag when the door of the hardware store 2 buildings down opened, and a small man in a canvas apron stepped out. He was in his 60s with the compact, careful presence of someone who had operated the same business in the same town for a long time, and had therefore witnessed considerable amounts of whatever this particular town produced. He looked at Ray. Then he looked at Greer's shop. Then back at Ray. "You the biker from last night," he said. "The one Walt Pruitt had in the diner." "That's me." The man in the apron looked up and down the street. He lowered his voice. "I've got a security camera on the outside of my store," he said. "Covers the parking lot across the way. I've had it for 4 years because kids used to break into cars at night." He paused. "I checked it this morning, after I saw what happened to that garage down at the end of the block." Ray went very still. "You want to come inside?" the man said, "and look at something with me." His name was Gerald Hatch. He'd owned Hatch Hardware for 31 years. He was not the kind of man who looked for trouble or invited it. He was the kind of man who kept his head down and ran his store and went home to his wife and didn't say much about the things he observed in the daily operation of a small Indiana town. But he had 3 daughters. He'd told Ray that while they walked to the back office where the monitor sat. He said it without context. He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. The footage was time-stamped from the previous evening. Gerald found the section without much searching, which told Ray he'd already watched it more than once before this morning. He turned the monitor so Ray could see it clearly. The angle was wide. It caught the side street and the edge of the diner parking lot, and a significant portion of the space between. At 9:47 p.m., approximately 12 minutes after Ray had sat down at Mama's table, a figure appeared at the edge of the frame, moving from the direction of the auto shop. Young, gray jacket, moving with the particular pace of someone who is trying to look like they're not doing anything specific. He went to the motorcycle. He worked quickly. Gerald had paused it in 4 places where the motion was clear enough. The valve stem, the engine compartment, the oil reservoir cap. Each one deliberate, each one done with the knowledge of where to look and what to do. When the boy finished, he walked back the way he'd come. At 9:51 p.m., a vehicle Ray recognized as Sheriff Walt Pruitt's department SUV pulled onto the side street and stopped. The window came down. The boy in the gray jacket stood beside it for approximately 30 seconds. Then the window went up and the SUV pulled away. Gerald stopped the footage. "I can make you a copy," he said. On a thumb drive, Ray looked at the frozen screen. "Gerald," he said, "I need to ask you something. When I'm done with what I'm gonna do with this, are you gonna be all right in this town?" Gerald thought about it for a moment. He looked at the monitor. "My store's been here for 31 years, he said. "Walt Pruitt hasn't, and Frank Greer hasn't. And I've got 3 daughters, and I'll be damned if I want them growing up in a town where a man gets his vehicle destroyed for wanting to eat dinner while he's on his way to his sick kid." He made the copy. Ray sat in his truck in the parking lot behind Hatch Hardware and looked at the thumb drive in his palm. He thought about his next move with the same deliberate care with which he thought about most things that mattered. Not rushing. Not letting the anger drive. letting the facts arrange themselves in the order that would do the most good. He called Boone. Boone was the vice president of the chapter. He'd been riding with Ray for 18 years. His voice on the phone was the specific calm of a man who has been on the other end of serious calls before and knows how to listen to what's underneath the words. Ray told him everything. He went through it in order. He didn't editorialize. He stated the facts the way he'd learned to state them, when the facts were enough on their own. When he was done, Boone was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What do you need?" Ray thought about. Darlene Webb standing her ground while the room emptied. He thought about Gerald Hatch making a thumb drive copy of footage that could make things very complicated for men who had spent years making things complicated for other people. He thought about Norma Foster in her nursing scrubs, standing in front of her late husband's broken garage. "I need Grady Wills," Ray said. "If he's available." Another pause. "Grady's in Memphis. He can be in Crowfield by morning." Grady Wills had ridden with the chapter for 11 years. Before that, he'd been a private investigator with a license in 3 states, including Indiana, working mostly civil cases, insurance, fraud, asset location, the kind of careful, document-intensive work that required patience and precision, and a systematic understanding of how money and power move through institutional channels. He'd retired from the PR business 6 years ago, but he hadn't retired from understanding how things worked. That was not the kind of knowledge you retired from. "Send him," Ray said. Then there was a silence on the line that Boone let Ray fill if he wanted to fill it. "There's something else," Ray said. He said the name, James Foster. Colorado chapter. Left the club around 2009 when his wife had a baby. Passed away around 2015. Boone was quiet for a moment that was longer than the previous ones. "Jimmy Foster," Boone said. "Yeah, I knew Jimmy. Good man. Mechanic. Could fix anything with an engine in it, didn't matter what it was or how far gone." He paused. "Why are you asking about Jimmy Foster?" Ray looked out the windshield at the October sky above Crowfield, Indiana. The particular blue of it thin and cold and very clear. "Because his son fixed my motorcycle last night at midnight and wouldn't take $1 for it. And some people in this town just destroyed his garage." The silence on Boone's end was the kind of silence that has a temperature. "Jimmy's boy," Boone said. He said it quietly, the way you say something when you need a moment to understand what you're feeling about it. "His name is Dex," Ray said. "He's 14 years old. He's got his father's hands, and apparently his father's sense of right and wrong. And he's got a broken garage and a mama working 2 jobs. Boone didn't say anything for a long time. Then he said, "How many do you want?" Ray looked at the graffiti on the wall of Mama's table visible from where he was parked. 2 words in black paint over warm yellow brick. The work of someone who had confused fear with strength, because they'd never been required to tell the difference. "Everyone who can ride," Ray said. Boone said he'd make the calls. He said Grady would be there by 6 in the morning. He said Ray should go back to the hospital and be with his daughter, and let the machinery of it move the way it was gonna move. Ray said he would. He sat in the parking lot for another few minutes after he hung up. He sat with the thumb drive in his palm, and he thought about what was coming and what it was supposed to accomplish and whether he was doing this for the right reasons or just the satisfying ones. He thought about Darlene, who had been losing customers and facing suspended credit lines and receiving below-market acquisition offers, all as the direct consequence of treating a stranger with basic dignity. He thought about Dex, who had given Ray something irreplaceable and was gonna wake up this morning and find out that the world had responded to his father's code by breaking his windows and bending his tools. He thought about the particular clarity of Gerald Hatch's face when he said, "I'll be damned if I want them growing up in a town where a man gets his vehicle destroyed for wanting to eat dinner." He thought about Lily in room 412, her hand warm in his drifting back under sedation, with a smile on her face because he'd come. He thought about Claire. He thought about the way the road always seemed to be between him and the people who needed him. The way distance was the specific form his failure took over and over. The same shape repeated in different years with different faces, but the same fundamental geometry of absence. He had not been absent last night. He had pushed a dead motorcycle 2 miles through a town that didn't want him there. And he had found the one person in that town who operated by a different code. And he had gotten to his daughter in time. That had happened. That was done, and it was real. And Lily had smiled when she found his face. But Darlene's wall was still covered in black paint, and Dex's garage was still full of broken glass. Ray put the truck in gear. He drove back through Crowfield one more time before he left. He drove slowly, the way you drive when you want to remember something accurately. He noted the distances. He noted the layout of the main street, the width of it, the available space on either side. He noted the parking areas and the side streets, and the general geography of the town center. He was thinking about 800 motorcycles and where you put them. He stopped once in front of Mama's table. He got out and looked at the graffiti from 6 feet away. The paint was flat and cheap, the kind you buy at a hardware store, and it had been applied in a hurry by someone who was trying to make a statement with size rather than precision. The brick underneath was good brick original construction, solid and porous enough that, with the right preparation, it would take paint the way good brick takes paint. He took 3 photographs. He got back in the truck. He thought about colors. He thought about what color you put on a wall when you wanted to say something different than what was written on it. He thought about orange and yellow, the colors of the sign Ruth Ann had painted on the garage wall back home when Lily was 2 years old. The wall that faced east, so the morning light hit it first. He thought about sunrise. He drove back toward the highway. He drove north and east through the flat Indiana farmland, the fields harvested and bare, now the earth dark, and prepared for what came next. The sky above them was the same cold, clear blue it had been all morning. He called Ruth Ann from the road. She answered right away. Lily was awake again, she said. She'd eaten a few crackers. She'd asked where Daddy was. "Tell her I'll be back before dark," Ray said. "Tell her everything is okay." "Is it?" Ruth Ann asked. "It's going to be," Ray said. He meant it in more than one direction. He meant it for Lily, and he meant it for Darlene, and he meant it for Dex Foster. 14 years old with his father's tools and his father's code, and a broken window he shouldn't have to pay for. He meant it for all of them. He pushed the truck up to highway speed and drove toward the hospital. And the October sky opened out ahead of him, wide and cold and perfectly clear in all directions. The kind of sky that makes you feel like you can see all the way to what's coming next. What was coming was 800 motorcycles. He had people to take care of. Grady Wills arrived in Crowfield at 5:47 in the morning, 13 minutes ahead of schedule, which was consistent with everything Ray knew about the man. He was 61 years old and built like someone had assembled him from spare parts that were all individually too large. His forearms were the size of most men's calves. He had a gray beard kept short and a way of moving through a room that suggested he had already cataloged everything in it before you noticed him enter. He had ridden 11 years with the chapter, and before that had spent 2 decades doing private investigative work across Indiana, Illinois, and Kentucky, the kind of work that required patience and a systematic understanding of how institutions protected themselves and where the gaps in that protection tended to appear. He met Ray in the parking lot of a truck stop 4 miles outside Crowfield, at a table in the back corner, away from the counter and the early breakfast crowd. He had a laptop open and a cup of coffee and a leather notebook that was dense with handwriting in a small, precise hand. He had been working since Ray called Boone the previous afternoon. Ray sat down across from him, and Grady turned the laptop so Ray could see the screen and walked him through it, the way a man walks you through something when he has done the work carefully and wants the work to speak for itself. Frank Greer had filed 3 formal offers to purchase the property at 411 Main Street, Crowfield. The building currently housing Mama's Table over the past 9 years. The first 2 had been declined by Estelle Webb Darlene's mother, who had owned the property outright since 1987. The third had been filed 14 months after Estelle's death and had been declined by Darlene Webb as the new sole owner of record. All 3 offers were documented in the county recorder's office. All 3 were below assessed market value. The most recent offer was the furthest below. Walt Pruitt had been appointed sheriff of Crowfield County 6 years ago. He was Frank Greer's brother-in-law, married to Greer's younger sister in 2003. This relationship was public record, but not prominently known. Grady noted because Pruitt had kept his wife's name out of his professional biography, and most residents had simply never connected the two. The deputy who had responded to the call about Foster's garage had filed a report. Grady had obtained a copy through channels he declined to specify. The report described the damage as consistent with juvenile vandalism and noted no suspects identified, an investigation ongoing. It had been filed at 11:14 the previous morning. By 2 p.m. the same day, it had been administratively flagged for low-priority follow-up, which in practical terms meant it would not be actively worked. The flag had been entered by Sheriff Pruitt personally. And then there was the footage from Gerald Hatch's camera, which Ray had transferred to Grady the previous evening, and which Grady had spent several hours with cross-referencing the timestamp against the official log of Pruitt's department vehicle movements, which were tracked by GPS as required by county policy. At 9:51 p.m. on the night in question, Pruitt's department vehicle had been logged as stationary on the side street adjacent to the Mama's Table parking lot for 31 seconds. This matched the footage precisely. Grady closed the notebook and looked at Ray. "It's not a criminal case yet," he said. "Not until the DA decides it is. But it's enough for a civil filing, and it's enough to make a significant amount of noise at the county level about the conduct of the sheriff's office. It's enough to get the state police interested, which means Pruitt loses control of any investigation. And it's enough to give Darlene Webb grounds to challenge the business interference through her bank and her suppliers, Because we can document that the parties applying pressure have a direct financial interest in her property and a documented relationship with the law enforcement officer who failed to investigate the vandalism against her business. Ray looked at the documents on the screen. He looked at the neat columns of dates and figures and institutional references that Grady had assembled in less than 24 hours from his kitchen table in Memphis. "Can we file today?" Ray asked. Grady picked up his coffee. "I already did. Filed at 6 this morning when the county court opened. Trespass, property destruction, civil harassment, interference with business operations, and a formal complaint against the Crowfield County Sheriff's Office for failure to investigate and potential conflict of interest." He paused. "I also sent copies to the Indiana State Police, the State Attorney General's office, and the regional FBI field office in Indianapolis." Ray looked at him. "The FBI," he said. "When you have a sheriff actively coordinating with a private citizen to facilitate property crimes and suppress investigation of those crimes, Grady said evenly you have the potential for federal civil rights violations. I'm not saying it rises to that level. I'm saying that when the FBI receives a complaint, the local sheriff finds out about it quickly, and the local sheriff's behavior tends to change in proportion to his awareness of federal interest." Ray sat with that for a moment. "Frank Greer is going to know about this by noon." Grady continued. "His attorney will call him. He will understand that the situation has changed considerably since yesterday morning, when he thought he was pressuring a woman into selling a building. He will likely spend the rest of the day exploring his options. And Pruitt is going to have a very difficult week." Grady closed the laptop. "I've done what I can do from a document standpoint. The rest of it, what happens in that town today, that's yours." Ray put both hands flat on the table. 800 people are meeting at the Fairfield County Fairgrounds at 9 a.m., he said. "We'll be in Crowfield by 10. Grady nodded slowly. "One more thing," Ray said. "The window at Foster's garage. I told Norma Foster I'd cover it. I want it replaced today before we get there, so Dex doesn't spend another night with a broken window in his father's garage." Grady wrote something in the notebook. "I'll make a call." He paused. "James Foster's boy. You knew James. Everybody in the Midwest chapters knew James." Grady's voice had gone quieter. "He was the kind of man who showed up when you called him. Showed up and did what needed doing and didn't require recognition for it." He looked at the notepad. "That boy is gonna be all right." Ray stood up. He drove to the fairgrounds. The parking lots were already filling when he arrived. They had been filling since before dawn. Bikers coming in from Louisville and Indianapolis and Cincinnati and Chicago and Columbus and from smaller towns scattered across 4 states converging on this flat piece of Indiana farmland in response to calls that had gone out through the chapter network over the previous 18 hours. The sound of engines was a continuous rolling presence in the air, individual machines arriving and joining the larger sound until the larger sound was something you felt as much as heard. Ray parked and stood at the edge of the lot and watched them come. He had been part of this brotherhood for 20 years. He had watched it respond to things before. He knew what it looked like when the chapter moved with purpose. But 800 was different. 800 was something you had to look at for a while before your mind could process the full scale of it. The rows of machines went further than seemed reasonable. The faces multiplied past the point where you could track individuals and became instead a collective, a single organism made of chrome and leather. and the particular kind of loyalty that doesn't require explanation because it predates language. Boone found him at 8:45. He was a big man, Boone with a white beard and hands that had built and repaired more things than he could probably remember. He clapped Ray on the shoulder and stood beside him and looked out at the gathering. "Jimmy Foster's boy," Boone said. Ray nodded. Boone was quiet for a moment. "Jimmy came to me once," he said. "This was maybe 6 months before he left the chapter. He came to me and he said, 'Boone, I've got a kid coming and I'm trying to figure out what kind of man I want that kid to see when he looks at me.' He said he thought the patch was fine, but he wanted more than the patch to be his answer. He wanted the answer to be something simpler than that." "What did you tell him?" Ray asked. "I told him to go. He'll be a good father." Boone looked at the rows of motorcycles. "I think he did." Ray thought about Dex in his 2 large coveralls, working by lamplight, saying you judge people by what they do, not by what they're wearing. He thought James Foster would have recognized that sentence. At 9 o'clock, Ray stood on the tailgate of Boone's truck at the edge of the lot, and 800 people arranged themselves in the open space before him in the casual but attentive way of people who have gathered for a purpose and are ready to hear it stated. He didn't prepare remarks. He didn't need to. He told them about a woman who ran her mother's diner in a small Indiana town and had served him a meal when no one else in that town would, and had done it without calculation, and was now facing the coordinated destruction of everything her mother had left her. He told them about a 14-year-old kid who had fixed his motorcycle at midnight in a garage his father had built and had refused to take $1 for it, and whose garage now had a broken window and bent tools and spray paint on the sign. He told them whose son that boy was. He didn't tell them what to do when they got to Crowfield. He didn't need to. When he stopped talking, someone in the back of the crowd asked if they were bringing paint. "There's a hardware supply truck meeting us there," Boone said. "Paintbrushes, rollers, tools, lumberglass." The crowd moved. Engines started. The sound of it built from individual notes into the full chord of it, something you felt in your sternum and your jaw, and the column of machines began to form on the access road and pull toward the highway. 800 motorcycles. Ray rode at the front. They came into Crowfield from the west on Route 40, and they came in the way 800 motorcycles come into a town, which is to say, the town knew they were coming before they arrived. The sound preceded them. It moved through the buildings and along the streets, and through the window glass of houses where people had been eating breakfast, or reading the paper, or watching the morning news. And those people set down their forks and their papers and looked out their windows. The column came down Route 40 and turned onto Main Street and filled it from sidewalk to sidewalk. Engines idling, chrome catching the October morning light. The Hells Angels patches visible on 800 backs, moving slowly through the center of a town of 3,000 people who had come out to their porches and their storefronts and their sidewalks and were standing in the particular silence of a crowd that does not yet know what is about to happen. Ray stopped his bike in front of Mama's table. He cut the engine. 800 engines cut behind him one after another in a cascading sequence that took almost a full minute to complete. And then there was a silence over Crowfield, Indiana, that was the loudest thing Ray had ever heard. He got off the bike. He walked to the front of Mama's table and he stood in front of the graffiti on the yellow brick wall. He turned and faced the street. He looked at the residents of Crowfield standing on their sidewalks looking back at him. and he looked at the 800 people who had ridden through the night and the early morning to be standing in this street. "We came to fix what got broken," he said. His voice carried in the silence. Nobody said anything. He turned back to the wall. Someone handed him a brush. That was all it required. That one moment of a man picking up a brush and beginning to work. The hardware supply truck had parked on the side street and was already being unloaded cans of paint and primer and rollers and drop cloths, moving hand to hand through the crowd with the efficiency of people who had done physical work together before. A team went directly to Foster's garage at the end of the block, where the replacement window had been delivered 2 hours earlier per Grady's call. 4 people began the window installation with tools they'd brought in their saddlebags. Others gathered the bent tools from the concrete and assessed what could be straightened and what needed replacement. The main wall of Mama's table got primer first. 3 people on each section working in overlapping strokes, covering the black paint with a base coat that went on white and would hold whatever came next. Ray was mixing color when Darlene came out. She stood in the doorway of her mother's diner and looked at the street. She looked at the people working on her wall. She looked at Ray with the brush in his hand and the paint can at his feet. Her face did not immediately resolve into any single expression. It moved through several of them disbelief and recognition, and something that lived at the intersection of grief and gratitude. And then she pressed both hands over her mouth and stood in the doorway and let it happen. Ray walked to her. "My mama built this wall," she said. Her voice was muffled behind her hands. "We're gonna make it better than it was," Ray said. She looked at the wall, at the people on the ladders and the people mixing paint and the people organizing the equipment with the practice coordination of a work crew that had shown up ready. Why, she said, "After everything this town did to you," Ray thought about the right way to answer that, "because you didn't do what this town did." He said finally, "And Dex didn't. And a man at the hardware store didn't. And that's the thing about a town. It's not one thing. It's all the individual people in it making individual choices about what they're going to do when it costs them something." Darlene looked at him. "Your mama would be proud," he said, for the second time. This time it broke her completely open, quietly, the way deep feeling breaks through, when you stop trying to hold it back. She stood in the doorway of Mama's table and wept without any sound, and Ray stood beside her and led her, and around them 800 people continued to work. The color for the wall had been Ray's idea. He'd thought about it on the drive back from Crowfield the day before. He'd thought about what you put on a wall that had been used to say something hateful. What color and what image could stand in front of that and make it true that what was underneath no longer had any authority over what was visible. He'd thought about sunrise. The color went on in sections, warm gold at the base moving upward through amber and orange, and then the particular soft pink that exists for about 4 minutes on a clear morning before the day fully establishes itself. A woman named Rita, who rode out of the Indianapolis chapter and had been painting murals in her city for 15 years, directed the color work with the authority of someone who understood exactly what a wall was capable of saying. By noon, the primer was dry and the color work had begun in earnest. Down at Foster's garage, the new window was in. The bent tools had been assessed, and the ones that could be salvaged had been straightened on a portable anvil someone had brought in their truck. The ones that couldn't be salvaged had been noted on a list. 3 people were repainting the sign. A fourth was cleaning the oil stain from the concrete with a solvent that smelled sharp and clean in the October air. Dex came home from school at 3:15. Ray was standing near the garage when the school bus stopped at the corner, and a kid in jeans and a gray sweatshirt stepped off, with a backpack over one shoulder, and stopped completely still on the sidewalk. He looked at the garage, at the new window catching the afternoon light, at the cleaned concrete and the repainted sign, and the organized tools visible through the open bay door. He looked at the people still working, moving around the space with purpose. Then he looked at Ray. Ray walked to him. Dex's face was doing the same complicated thing Darlene's had done, the specific emotional arithmetic of someone trying to process more than their ordinary circuits were built to handle. "We covered the window," Ray said, "and your tools. The ones that were bent too far are on a list. We'll replace them." Dex looked at the sign above the garage door. Foster's Garage in clean black letters on white, the same hand-painted style as the original which Rita had photographed and replicated. Who did the sign, Dex said? Woman named Rita. She does murals. Ray paused. She said your dad's sign had good bones. Dex pressed his lips together. He looked at the window. He looked at the tools. "I've been thinking all day," he said. "Since Mom told me this morning before school. I kept thinking about what my dad would say if he were here." "What do you think he would say?" Dex was quiet for a moment. "He would say that somebody always has to be first. He said that to me once. We were talking about something at school. Some situation where nobody was standing up for something that needed standing up for. And he said, 'Dex, the thing you've got to understand is that somebody always has to be first. And once they are, other people can follow.'" Ray looked at this 14-year-old kid with his father's face and his father's code. "Your dad was a good man," Ray said. "I know." Dex's voice was steady. He'd made his peace with the grief of it at some point before tonight. The way kids who lose a parent early either do or don't. And this one had. "I'm gonna be one too." Ray believed him completely. Norma Foster came home from her day shift at 4:30 and stood on the sidewalk in front of the garage and put her hand over her face for a long moment. Then she put her arm around her son and held him against her side. And the two of them stood there together looking at the restored garage of James Foster, who had built it and loved it and left it to them. Ray gave them that moment. He walked back to the main street. The wall of Mama's table was remarkable. Rita and her crew had worked through the afternoon, and what covered the wall now was something that warranted looking at slowly, the way things that are done well warrant looking at slowly. The sunrise moved across the entire front face of the building. The warm, graduated colors he'd imagined on the drive back from Crowfield. But better than he'd imagined because Rita had added something he hadn't thought of. At the center of the image, where the light was brightest, she had painted the silhouette of a woman standing in a doorway, arms at her sides, head up facing whatever was coming toward her. It looked like Estelle Webb. Darlene said so quietly, standing beside Ray, looking at it, that it looked exactly like her mother. Rita had never seen a photograph. "Sometimes you just know what a person looks like," Rita said, "when you hear enough about them." By 5 in the afternoon, the main work was done and the street had transformed. The town had been watching all day from porches and storefronts. and the sidewalk margins maintaining a cautious distance that had slowly been closing as the hours passed. Not all of them had come closer. Some had gone back inside, but some had stayed. And some of those had started to talk to the people working, and some of those conversations had turned into something: coffee brought out from houses, sandwiches. A woman from the Baptist church who arrived with 2 thermoses at noon and said nothing beyond asking how people took it. The children had come first, the way children always do. They had no investment in the politics of it. They saw people doing interesting things with color and tools, and they drifted over with the natural gravity of children toward activity. And then they were handing things and holding things and asking questions and getting answers. And by mid-afternoon, there were kids helping Darlene string orange and black lights along the roofline of Mama's table, and kids helping the garage crew, and kids sitting on motorcycles under careful adult supervision with enormous expressions of private satisfaction on their faces. Their parents had followed some of them. Mrs. Hartwell found Ray at 4:30. She came across the street from the direction of her house on the residential block behind the main street, and she was wearing a coat over what appeared to be whatever she'd been wearing at home, as if she'd made the decision to come quickly and not allowed herself time to change her mind by changing her clothes. She stopped in front of Ray and looked at the wall and then looked at him. She was not the person who had accused him of theft in that diner 2 nights ago. That person had been certain and elevated and armored by the assumption that her certainty was a form of virtue. The person standing in front of him now was something else. She was smaller, and not because she had shrunk physically, but because the armor was gone. "I owe you an apology," she said. She said it to her coat buttons. Then she made herself look at him. "What I did in that diner. Accusing you of something you didn't do. In front of everyone. Because of how you look. Because of what you're wearing." She stopped. Started again. "I had already decided what you were before you sat down. I decided, and then I made the facts fit the decision I'd already made. And you were just a man who needed dinner and was trying to get to his sick little girl." Ray looked at her. "I've been standing at my window watching what's happening out here all day," she said. "And I've been thinking about who I was in that diner and who these people are who came here to fix what got broken. And I think I got it very wrong. About most of it." Ray said, "My daughter's gonna be okay." Mrs. Hartwell's eyes filled. "I'm so glad," she said. "I am genuinely so glad." He believed her. That was the thing. Whatever she had been 2 nights ago, what he saw in front of him now was genuine. People were not fixed objects. That was the lesson the road kept teaching him, and he kept needing to learn. He said, "You can tell people what you saw today, what actually happened here. That would mean something." She nodded. She looked at the wall. She stood there for a while looking at the sunrise and the silhouette in the doorway. "Your friend who painted this," she said. Finally. "She's remarkable." Rita was on a ladder touching up the upper right corner. Ray called up to her and told her she had an admirer. Rita said the wall admired itself, she just introduced it to its colors. The old man with the cane appeared at 5:15. Ray had seen him at intervals throughout the day, standing on the far side of the street watching. He had the careful, deliberate movement of someone whose body required advanced planning from his mind, but whose mind was still fully operational. He crossed the street one careful step at a time and stopped in front of the largest biker Ray had ever seen in person. A man from the Cincinnati chapter named Wallace, who was 6'5" and 300 pounds, and had both arms sleeved in ink from wrist to shoulder. The old man looked up at Wallace. Wallace looked down at the old man. "You want a coffee?" Wallace said. The old man said he took it black. Wallace got him a coffee. They stood together in front of the restored wall of Mama's table in the October afternoon light and drank their coffee, the old man and the enormous tattooed biker. And Ray watched them and thought that the world was strange and specific and occasionally more capable of surprise than you had learned to expect. At 6 o'clock, Darlene unlocked the front door of Mama's table and said dinner was on her. The diner was not large enough for 800 people. It was large enough for the 40 or so who cycled through over the course of the evening, sitting in booths and at the counter in groups of 8 and 10, eating what Darlene and Eddie put out, which was everything available in the kitchen, delivered in a continuous stream until it ran out. People waited on the sidewalk and came in as others left, and Darlene moved through it all with the particular grace of a woman doing what she was built to do, in the space she was built to do it in. Ray sat at the counter. Darlene put a plate in front of him without asking what he wanted because she remembered from 2 nights ago, and it was the same meatloaf and the same mashed potatoes and the same cornbread, and this time Ray tasted it. She also put 2 slices of pecan pie on the counter. "One for you," she said, "and one for Lily, for when she's ready." Ray looked at the pie. He thought about the 2 slices she'd tucked into that bag 2 nights ago that had ridden 90 miles in his saddlebag while he was riding for his daughter's life. He thought about the woman who had made that gesture when she was already losing customers and knew she would lose poor. "Your mama raised you right," he said. Darlene smiled. "She reminded me of that every single day for 30 years. I got pretty good at listening." Ray had one more conversation that evening. He had been watching Frank Greer's auto shop all day from the corner of his eye. The truck had been in the lot in the morning. By noon, it was gone. It had not returned. Walt Pruitt's department vehicle did not appear on Main Street at any point during the day. Ray learned from Boone, who had spoken to Grady mid-afternoon, that Pruitt had received notification of the state police complaint at 11 in the morning, and had spent the subsequent hours in meetings with the county attorney. Grady had called Ray at 4:30 with an update. The bank had reinstated Darlene's credit line after receiving documentation of the complaint filed on her behalf. The supply company had agreed to a call with Darlene's attorney. The formal property complaint against Frank Greer would be heard by the county court on a date to be scheduled. Ray thanked him. "That's the document side," Grady said. "The rest of it is harder to put in a file. But I'll tell you this. Towns remember things. This town is gonna remember today." "That's not nothing." "It's not nothing," Ray agreed. At 7 in the evening, as the light was going, and the October cold was coming back into the air, with intent, the engines began to start. Not all at once. One, and then another. And then many, the familiar sound, building from individual back to collective. The sound Ray had known for 20 years. The sound that meant something was over, and something else was beginning. He said his goodbyes. Boone last of all a grip that communicated things they had said to each other, enough times that the words weren't necessary. "Get home to your girl," Boone said. Ray got on his bike. He was the last to leave. He sat on the motorcycle in the middle of Main Street and looked at Crowfield, Indiana one full time. He looked at the wall of Mama's table with the sunrise on it and the silhouette of a woman in a doorway who looked like Estelle Webb. He looked at Foster's garage at the end of the block with its new window and its clean sign. He looked at the Halloween lights strung along the roof lines and the jack-o'-lanterns lined up on the steps and the orange streamers moving slightly in the evening wind. He looked at the few residents still on the sidewalk who raised their hands as the last motorcycle prepared to leave. He raised his hand back. Then he twisted the throttle and rode. Lily came home 10 days later. The recovery had not been easy in the way that real recoveries are not easy, which is to say it was made of small incremental improvements that on any individual day didn't feel like much, but across 10 days added up to something real and measurable. The color came back to her face. The IV lines came out one by one until there was only one left. And then that one came out too. She ate. First crackers, then soup, then actual food that she actually wanted, and on day 7 she had demanded specifically the apple slices with peanut butter that Ruth Ann made at home. And Ruth Ann had driven to the hospital with them in a container. And Lily had eaten every one. On the morning of day 10, Dr. Alvarez came in and looked at everything that needed looking at and said she could go home. Lily received this information with a gravity appropriate to its magnitude. Then she asked if she could stop somewhere on the way. She had been told in age-appropriate terms and at intervals selected by Ray's judgment about what had happened in Crowfield. About Darlene, who had fed her daddy when no one else would. About Dex, who had fixed the motorcycle when no one else could. She had listened with the focused attention she reserved for things that mattered, and had asked careful questions and had gone quiet in the particular way she went quiet when she was integrating something large. On day 8, she had told Ray that she wanted to go thank them. She said it the way she said things she had thought about for a while and arrived at a conclusion on. Not impulsively, as a statement of intention. Ray had said they would. He had also said nothing about the costume. That had been Ruth Ann's department. Ruth Ann had found it and purchased it and kept it in the car, and said nothing about it until the morning of discharge, when she produced it from the hospital bag with the neutral expression of someone who has done a perfectly reasonable thing and sees no need to explain it. It was a superhero cape, red with a gold star. Lily saw it and looked at Ray. Ray looked at the ceiling. She put it on over her hospital discharge clothes and wore it out of Memorial Hospital, with the cape trailing behind her and her hand in Ray's in the October sun on her face. And she stood at the curb with her eyes closed for a moment before she got in the car, just feeling the outside air on her skin after 10 days of recycled hospital air. And Ray stood beside her and let her have that. They drove to Crowfield. Ray had called Darlene the day before to say they were coming. Darlene had said she would make sure Dex was there after school. They pulled up to Mama's table at 3:45. Lily pressed her face against the car window when the building came into view and said nothing for a long moment. She was looking at the wall. The sunrise was still there, warm and permanent in the October light. The graduated gold and amber, and the soft pink at the top, and the silhouette of a woman in the doorway facing whatever was coming. "It's beautiful," Lily said. "A woman painted it," Ray said. How did she know what colors Ray thought about it? She knew what the place deserved, he said. Darlene was at the door. She came out when she saw the car and stood on the step, and when Lily climbed out of the back seat wearing her red cape. Darlene put her hand over her heart and stood there for a moment. Lily walked up to her with the direct purposefulness of a 7-year-old who has decided something. "Thank you for helping my daddy," she said. Darlene crouched down to her level. She looked at Lily's face, the face Ray had been afraid he would not get to see. Grow up the face that had Lily's mother in it, around the eyes, and had Ray's determination in the set of the jaw. "Your daddy helped himself," Darlene said gently. "I just made sure he didn't do it hungry." Lily considered this. "He always does better when he's not hungry." She agreed. "He gets quiet." Darlene laughed. It was a real laugh, the kind that comes from somewhere unguarded. She straightened up and looked at Ray with the warmth of someone who has seen the full shape of something and finds it good. She brought them inside. Ruth Ann came in behind them and settled at the counter with the ease of a woman making herself at home, which was her particular gift in any space she entered. The diner had customers in it, not full but present, and the presence of them meant something after what Darlene had described 2 nights ago, when she told Ray about 3 customers in a day. The pecan pie came out, 2 slices, one for Ray, one for Lily. Lily tasted it, and her eyes went wide in the manner of a child encountering something genuinely beyond expectation. "This is the best thing," she said. "My mama's recipe," Darlene said. Lily looked at the photographs on the walls. The decades of them, the same building in different light, different clothes, different faces holding the same warmth underneath. "Is your mama in one of these?" Lily asked. Darlene pointed. The photograph was from the 70s, a younger version of the building, and a woman standing in the doorway with her arms folded and her chin up and the particular expression of someone who knows what they built and is not sorry for it. Lily looked at the photograph for a long time. "She looks like the painting," she said. Darlene was quiet for a moment. "She does," she agreed. Dex arrived at 4:10 on his bicycle, still in his school-clothes backpack, over one shoulder. He leaned the bike against the building and came inside and stopped when he saw Lily sitting at the counter in her red cape. He recovered quickly in the manner of a 14-year-old who was too old to be caught being surprised by things. "You must be Lily," he said. "I'm a superhero," she told him, which she apparently felt was the more relevant identification. "I can see that," Dex said. He sat down on the stool next to her and looked at Ray. "How's the bike running?" "Perfect," Ray said. "No problem since you fixed it." Dex nodded with the satisfaction of a craftsman receiving confirmation of work done properly. He ordered a slice of pie from Darlene and ate it with the unhurried appetite of a teenager who had ridden a bicycle 2 miles after 6 hours of school. Lily watched him eat with the evaluating attention she brought to people she had decided were important. "My daddy says you fixed his motorcycle when everybody else wouldn't," she said. Dex considered how to answer that. "I fixed it because it needed fixing, and I knew how he said. That's all. He said nobody would fix it because of his patch." Dex looked at the counter. "The patch is not who he is." He paused. "My dad told me that." Lily absorbed this with the seriousness of someone filing it in a permanent location. Then she reached into the pocket of her hospital discharge clothes and produced a piece of folded paper. She had made it in the hospital, Ray knew. Ruth Ann had brought her crayons on day 3, and she had made several things, most of them given to nurses. And she had made this one and told Ray it was for somebody specific, and she would deliver it herself. She unfolded it and smoothed it on the counter and pushed it toward Dex. He looked at it. It was a crayon drawing in the style that 7-year-olds draw, in which is to say with a fidelity to emotional truth rather than physical accuracy. There was a motorcycle, blue and black, with a figure on it. Next to the motorcycle was a garage identifiable by the word garage, written on it in careful capital letters. And in the doorway of the garage was a small figure with a wrench. She had written something along the bottom. Dex is the best mechanic in the world. Dex looked at the drawing for a long time. He was 14 years old and trying very hard to be in command of the situation. And he was not entirely succeeding. And the not succeeding was the most dignified thing Ray had seen all week. "Thank you," Dex said. His voice had gotten quieter. Lily nodded. It was the nod of a transaction completed satisfactorily. Then she turned back to her pie. Ray watched his daughter eat pecan pie at the counter of Mama's table and looked at the photographs on the wall and at the door that stood open to the afternoon and the painted wall visible beyond it. He listened to his daughter tell Dex in thorough detail about her time in the hospital, which she described with the narrative energy of someone who had experienced something significant and intended to do it justice. He listened to Dex ask her questions with a seriousness that she deserved and got. He thought about Claire. He thought about her in the way he'd been thinking about her lately, which was different from the way he'd thought about her for the past 3 years. For 3 years, he'd thought about her through the glass of the specific moment of her absence, the highway and the phone call, and the chaplain's face and the way the world had tilted. That glass had been between him and every other memory of her, distorting everything behind it. Lately, he'd been thinking about her before the glass. Claire at the kitchen table in the morning. Claire standing in the doorway watching him load the bike. Claire holding Lily at the hospital the day she was born, looking at her daughter with an expression that said she understood now exactly what love was for. He didn't know when the glass had started to shift. Maybe the night on the highway. Maybe the dark parking lot in Crowfield with the dead motorcycle and the choice between the grief and the movement. Maybe the moment Lily had opened her eyes in room 412 and found his face. Maybe it was simpler than that. Maybe it was just that he had gotten to his daughter in time, finally this time, and the fact of it had rearranged something that had been arranged wrong for 3 years. He would not get Claire back. That was permanent. That was a fact with no negotiation available. But Lily was sitting at a diner counter eating pie in a red cape, telling a 14-year-old boy about her surgical experience with the authority of someone who has survived something and knows it. And that was also permanent. And that was also a fact. He thought you could hold both facts at the same time. He thought maybe that was the whole of it, holding both facts at the same time without letting one erase the other. Darlene refilled his coffee without being asked and said nothing and moved on. He thought Claire would have liked her. At 5:30, Ray told Lily it was time to go. Lily had consumed her pie completely and had migrated to a booth with Dex where they were examining a photograph she had found on the wall depicting a motorcycle from the 1960s, which Dex was explaining with the pedagogical enthusiasm of someone who rarely found an audience interested in the subject. She said 5 more minutes. Ray allowed it. When the 5 minutes had passed and they were actually leaving, Lily went to Darlene first and hugged her with the full commitment that she brought, to hugging her arms as far around as they would reach. Her face pressed into Darlene's apron, a moment that lasted long enough to be real. Then she went to Dex. She held out her hand. He shook it. Very solemn, very mutual. The handshake of two people who have reached an understanding. Dex reached into his backpack. He had brought something. Ray hadn't seen him bring it in, and suspected it had been planned in advance the way the drawing had been planned. He produced a small wrench, the kind used for finer work, chrome-plated and clean, with a piece of blue tape on the handle where he had written something in black marker. For Lily H. Every superhero needs to know how to fix things. Lily looked at the wrench, then at Dex. "Thank you," she said, with the same completeness she brought to the hug. She put the wrench in her cape pocket. They walked out into the October evening. The sun was low, and the light from it was the specific amber of late afternoon in the middle of the country, wide and warm and going fast. The painted wall caught it directly and held it, the sunrise image lit by actual setting light. And Ray stood on the sidewalk and looked at it one more time. He helped Lily into the car. Ruth Ann settled into the passenger seat. Ray stood outside the driver's door for a moment. Darlene was in the doorway. He raised his hand. She raised hers. He got in the car. They drove out of Crowfield, going east. The town fell away behind them in the mirror, the main street, and the lit windows and the painted wall of Mama's table visible from the highway until the road curved, and then it wasn't. Ray watched it go. Lily had the wrench in her lap. She was looking at it in the fading light. "Daddy," she said. "Yeah, baby. Were you scared when my bike got broken and you didn't know how to get to me?" Ray thought about the parking lot in the dark, about 3 mechanics and the fence outside Morgan's Repair, and the singular heaviness of sitting on that ground at midnight, 90 miles from his daughter. "Yeah," he said. "I was scared. But you kept going. I kept going." She turned the wrench over in her hands. "That's what superheroes do," she said. "They get scared and they keep going anyway." Ray drove east into the October evening and said nothing because there was nothing to add to that. The stars were coming out by the time they reached the highway. Cold and clear and very far away, the same stars that had been overhead when he'd stood in Marcus Webb's driveway and heard Ruth Ann's voice crack on the other end of a phone line. The same stars that had been there on the highway outside Crowfield when he'd been riding his daughter's photograph toward a hospital 90 miles away. The same stars that had been above Foster's garage when a 14-year-old kid in 2 large coveralls had looked at a man with a Hell's Angels patch and decided to see a person instead. They were just stars. They didn't know any of this. But Ray drove under them with his daughter asleep in the back seat, and her hand curled around a small chrome wrench, and the cape spread over her like a blanket. And he felt something that had been shaped wrong inside him for 3 years settle into something closer to its correct position. Not healed. Not resolved. Just settled. The way a bone that has been set properly still takes time to knit, but at least is no longer set wrong. He had been on the road when Claire needed him, and he would carry that. He would carry it the rest of his life. Not because he deserved punishment, but because it was true. And true things have weight. And carrying the weight of true things is part of what it means to be a person who is trying to live honestly. But he had been there when Lily needed him. He had pushed a dead motorcycle 2 miles and found the one door in a town that was open. And he had gotten to room 412 before the conversation with Dr. Alvarez would have been different. That was also true. And true things have weight in both directions. He drove home through the Indiana dark, past the small towns with their brief interruptions of light, past the grain elevators and the church steeples, past all the ordinary evidence of people building their lives in the specific places they had chosen or arrived at or been given. Ruth Ann dozed beside him. Lily slept in the back with her cape and her wrench. Ray drove. He thought about tomorrow, about the hospital follow-up at 9, and Lily's return to school the week after, and the ordinary machinery of a life that was going to continue imperfect and irreplaceable, and full of road between him and the things that mattered, and the ongoing work of being the man who got there anyway. He thought about Dex Foster, who would open Foster's garage on Saturday morning and find the tools organized the way his father had taught him to organize them, and the new window clean in the October light, and who would go on learning what he was already learning, which was the same thing his father had known and had apparently passed down in the way that things worth knowing get passed down. Somebody always has to be first. He thought about Darlene Webb, who would open Mama's table tomorrow morning, the way she had opened it the morning after everything, because that was what you did with the thing that had been left to you. He thought about 800 people who had ridden through a night and a morning to fix what had been broken in a town that had tried to slow one man down on his way to his daughter and had not succeeded. He thought it had been a good week for the idea that kindness was worth something, that it cost something and returned something and was worth the cost. The road went on ahead of him, white line and dark shoulder, and the stars overhead doing what stars did, indifferent and permanent and very far away. He drove toward home. Lily slept. The cape covered her like a flag.